U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1958. And since that time, there have been a number of transfers and a number of different jobs which finally landed him in Washington, where he is currently serves the dual role of both Chief Landscape Architect as well as Assistant Director for Recreation. In addition to that, and I think of particular note to the landscape architecture profession, has been his outstanding service to the American Society of Landscape Architects, which included a term as president of the Potomac chapter, and also as a member of the executive committee for the national study of the profession of landscape architecture. He's chaired a number of national committees and seminars and panels. He's served in a number of positions on the executive committee for the national organization, which culminated in his election as president of the ASLA in 1975, and that is a position that he served for 2 years. Of particular note, and I think of particular value to the profession and to the society in his period as president and in many years following, I guess leading up until last year, was a program of visibility to make the profession of landscape architecture better understood by the public. This was begun during his administration, and it is still continuing on today, and I think it has had a very, very positive impact upon the education of the public. One of the vehicles for this program that was developed was the movie Legacy for Living, which I'm sure all of you have seen at one time or another. Ed is also a good friend and a very staunch supporter of education in landscape architecture. I first met Ed at Rutgers many years ago, and probably he has been to most of the schools of landscape architecture at one time or another, and we're very glad to have him with us tonight. His topic is visual resource management in the National Forest. Please welcome Ed Stone.
Well, we'll try to make this quick so that we can get on to the root beer floats. I think I better quit while I'm ahead after that introduction. There are basically three different aspects of landscape architecture in our organization, one of which I've been asked to speak on tonight. Back in the good old days when I started with our outfit, all landscape architects were hired for work in the field of recreation. We were big into building campgrounds and boating areas and picnic grounds and visitor centers and ski areas and so forth in those days. And that's what we all did. Later on in the 70s, when the environmental impacts began to hit us, the Forest Service became much more concerned with planning. And so we started a very strong effort, which continues until today, in what is commonly known in our field as land use planning. The Forest Service likes to call it land management planning because they have a thing about the word management, but it's the same thing. And a lot of landscape architects have drifted into that just because of their expertise and training in the field of planning. The third item, and it too was a result of the environmental push, is this thing we call visual resource management, and that's what I'll focus on tonight. We'll deal just a little bit with recreation to start with in the slides, just to give you some idea of what it's all about. But unfortunately, we won't have time to get into the planning part of it. There has been a significant growth in the Forest Service in our profession. When I started in 1958, there were 7 of us. We knew, all the landscape architects knew each other by name, and we knew where we were and so forth. Today we have 306, and I can't keep track of them all anymore. But that's a pleasant situation for me. Of the federal agencies, we employ by far the largest number. The Corps of Engineers is probably next with maybe 150, and the Park Service is third, probably with around 100. The BLM, Bureau of Land Management, in Interior is coming on strong, and they're probably up around 60 or 70 now. In the last few years, they have probably hired more faster than anybody else. For those of you who either now or after seeing the slides perhaps are somewhat interested in pursuing a career in the federal government as a landscape architect or even as an architect, there is a new application process which you may or may not have heard about. It's been in force now for about 4 years, in which a portfolio of your work, including slides of your work, is examined by a jury of your peers. A group is convened consisting primarily of federal landscape architects, but also including educators and private practitioners. Some of the best in the country have volunteered for this service, and they look through your work and give you a rating, which then the great civil service computer files away in its inimical fashion. And when an agency like ours, when any federal agency wants to hire either a landscape architect or an architect, they ask for a register, or a cert, which is a list of rated applicants spit out by the great computer, which lists you by your score, and we are required to choose from the top 3 on that list. And along with that comes your portfolio, so that now, in these 2 professions, unlike almost all others hired by the federal government, the person on the hiring end gets to see examples of your work, even though that person may be 2,000 or 3,000 miles away. It's been quite a change and quite helpful. And we can go into that more later if you wish. Incidentally, there is no more Civil Service Commission. That was changed under the Carter administration to the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. We call it opium in the Federal Service. And you have to get used to these things. They change from time to time. BOR became the HCRS and then disappeared and so forth. Boers became hookers and then vanished. Keeps us busy in Washington, tying down all these initials and making fun of same. If we can have the lights and the slides now, we'll get on to the serious part of the evening. If my pointer works. This ball game all started in about 1873 when the forest reserves were formed of some of the best of the forest resources in the United States. But there was no Forest Service in those days. It waited clear until the time of Teddy Roosevelt before the foresters were actually gathered in a group in Washington. Unfortunately, the foresters were in the Department of Agriculture and the forest reserves were in the Department of the Interior. Teddy, not being bashful, decided to change all that, and he moved the reserves from Interior to Agriculture. He said that our forest resources, being the crops of the soil and so forth, should be where all the other crops were taken care of. And so we were placed in the Department of Agriculture, and we've been there since. This was also the time of the Teapot Dome and other assorted scandals in Interior, and they didn't have a very good reputation. That may have had something to do with it. So now, much to everyone's confusions, the Park Service and many of the other so-called conservation agencies are in the Department of the Interior. We are in the Department of Agriculture. The national forests were originally established for the purposes of providing for the country wood and water in perpetuity. Along the way, other legislation came along which added forage for domestic livestock, habitat for wildlife. The states manage the wildlife itself, but we manage the habitat, and recreation. All of these are now legal functions of the Forest Service. Many people have different ideas about what the forests are for. And of course, some in industry and other places think that those trees are there for the cutting and should be cut forthwith. We do harvest a great deal of timber on the national forests. It is done by bid, and the money paid for it goes into the U.S. Treasury. We are one of the very few agencies in the federal government that occasionally turns a profit. There's also a good deal of mining done underneath, and in some cases this gets to be a very interesting situation, especially in the eastern forests that were purchased. In many cases the government was rather parsimonious in those days and did not bother to buy the mineral rights, so in some cases we don't own the surface, even though that's what we are managing. It makes for some very interesting situations. Others, some of our urban friends, think that the national forest looks something like this, and occasionally get there and sometimes don't. In any event, all of these resources are spread out around the country, as you see here, 187 million acres worth. To zero in on that a little bit, and we'll look a little closer at some of the western ones. By example, this is Yellowstone Park, the largest part of the national park system, 2 million acres. And this is Olympic and Yosemite. All of the green areas are the collective national forest. They run anywhere from 500,000 acres up to about 10 million acres in size each. And this is where most of our design people are, is out on national forest offices spread around the country. When we first started out, as I said, we were primarily involved in recreation, designing sites like this, a combination camping, picnicking, swimming beach, and so forth, tucked away into the forest, trying to be as natural as possible. Many boating areas, some done under a concessionaire basis as far as the management is concerned. Some geologic areas are providing access to these things for people to examine, both above ground and below ground in some places. And observation decks, this one in California. See the fine hand of a few landscape architects here. Visitor center in Alaska, done by a local architect there who loved the site as much as we did. Some interpretive facilities, such as this sign explaining killer whales in the same general area. Small facilities, bridges, trails, so forth. And we find that most of the, oh boy, well, I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Most of the major ski areas in the United States are either wholly or partly on national forest land under a permit system. And so we get involved with working very closely with the permittees who are designing these. Scenic roads have been our forte from time to time. This one under construction here was finished quite some time ago between Oklahoma and Arkansas. And the coming and booming recreation field of cross-country travel, snowmobile, cross-country skiing, hiking, all of that sort of thing, even an occasional dog team. Most of our facilities are out in what I refer to as God's country. Eventually you get promoted upstairs and have to leave all this. But that's where most of our people start out, in small towns, small college towns and whatnot, districts and forest supervisors' offices. Kind of a typical office here with a little bit of frustration going on in the background. And a Mark I decision maker on the wall to the right. We have various forms of travel, some of it somewhat unusual, in order to get around this prodigious landscape, 187 million acres. We have a little floating work camp in Alaska, for example. Excellent hotel facilities. The skipper is a terrific cook. I spent many happy days on that. And now on to our subject of the evening, this thing called visual resource management. Researchers tell us that 87% of our perception comes to us by way of sight, and therefore a very good reason for why we get involved with this thing called the visual resource. And incidentally, we, over a period of time, have gotten various indications from Congress, and finally it has been spelled out in a couple of places flat out that the visual is a resource, what we look at. In order to make this understandable to some of the natural science type people that we work with, we had to put together some handbooks to begin to explain what we're all about. We did this one as kind of a vocabulary, and we found that most of the training tools that were available to us were done with more or less urban examples, which didn't cut the mustard with foresters and soil scientists and whatnot. So we put one together using or discussing terms like form, line, color, and texture, and so forth, using examples that were common to them, and found that we achieved a much higher rate of understanding, talking about such things as contrast and axial arrangements and whatnot, that they began to see what we were talking about, and it helped us considerably. Then came our handbook that explained the system that we were trying to utilize in the management of the national forests on this thing called visual resource or landscape management. And it's a rather simple system, or at least it seems simple to us designers, but it proved to be rather complex to the others we work with who have everybody else's system to contend with as well as ours, in which we analyze essentially the variety of the landscape. In an area like this where you have a great deal of variety, this one would be a Class A with a good deal of rock slopes and mixed vegetation and whatnot. Up on top where you have a flat area of uniform vegetation, that would probably be a variety Class C. And in between where you have a mixture partway between would be B. We would begin to map this with the assumption that the more variety, the higher the value. Then because we are a public agency, we assume that it makes a difference to us how many and who sees it. If we were not a public agency, we might have just stopped with variety, but we didn't. We added this thing called sensitivity, which tries to rack up how many people are seeing it and of what importance is it to them. If people who have come a long way to use a national trail or something like that see this object out there, then we give it a very high rating. If it's only seen by local people who go up and down the road every day, we give it a somewhat lower rating. Also, we rate foreground, middle ground, and distance, or background, in a descending order. Try to put all this together by adding the variety to the sensitivity to come up with a composite, which is racked up according to this sort of thing, little matrix here. And what we end up with is what we call visual quality objectives, ranging from retention down to maximum modification. And we can map that too. This sort of thing becomes our input in the land management planning process, along with timber's input, range, wildlife, soils, everybody else. And all of this is racked together to come up with the direction for each acre of that 187 million. These visual quality objectives range from retention. Preservation is pretty well confined to designated wilderness areas where the only changes that will be allowed by law are essentially ecological changes. From then on, we get into areas that will be changed somewhat by man. In a retention area, once that label is given to a piece of ground by the land management plan, anything can be done in there as long as you can't see it. By the time you get down to maximum modification, this is where management activity dominates, and you will jolly well see what goes on there, but we will apply as much design sensitivity to it as is possible to kind of ameliorate the impact. And we'll see some examples of this as we go along. We also consider this thing called visual absorption capability. In a situation like this area here, this has a very high VAC, as we call it, because it will absorb a great deal of visual impact. We can design clear-cut timber sails in there, pipeline, power lines, ski areas and whatnot. As long as the impact emulates these natural openings, you can do most anything in there and get away with it visually. On the other side of that ridge, it's very, very difficult to do anything. That would have a very low VAC, very steep slopes, uniform cover. Almost anything you do in there is going to show up right now. And so that sort of thing enters into our calculations whenever the manager wants to know how easy is it going to be to do something, or how difficult, or how costly. Now, applying this to the various functions is what we'll deal with next here. In recreation, for example, we've taken a process that was developed primarily for our timber management by using a desktop computer and a little printer over here. We have applied this to the expansion of a major ski area. And of course, with a little digitizer, they put the base information into the machine, and it will draw up a perspective of what the various runs will look like. We tell the machine how high the average tree is in that area, and it'll draw trees around all of the runs, so that we can see which openings are going to be covered by the trees and which ones will be out in the open. Then somebody with a little old imagination will begin to work with this artistically to really bring out what we're showing here, the computer having furnished all of the base information. And with a little watercolor, we can begin to sketch it. And then on the actual mountain, when they do it, we get a predictable result. This particular ski area was redesigned once because the first time they ran it through the computer, the designers were aghast at what it looked like, and so they did it over again. And of course, their design does have to follow the fall line. You can't ski uphill very well. But there are various options when these things are being done, and they made some very significant changes here, and yet have an area that will create much less visual impact than what would have been done in a ski area many years ago. It's pretty high impact now because they've straw mulched all of the lower slopes in order to get the grass to grow. But once that whole thing greens up, with the islands and the way they've designed it, and many of the runs being almost hidden behind the trees, it will be considerably less impact than it would have been otherwise. In the field of timber, the management of the timber that we sell is probably the greatest opportunity for visual impact of anything that we do. Obviously, in the old days, it used to look like that most of the time, out west where there's very sizable timber. And where it was done right, this clear cutting is scientifically correct and is not ecologically damaging, but it looks like the wrath of God. When you're dealing with Douglas firs that are 200 to 300 feet high, this wall of timber is a very formidable problem. A new area will look like this, one that has been cut maybe 10 years ago. The young trees in here will be well over your head, but from a distance it looks like grass. This one down here, these may be 30 or 40-year-old trees, may be as large as much of anything that grows in Indiana, and yet it still looks very small in comparison to the others. So we have some real visual problems in trying to produce this resource for the country in perpetuity, and making it look more attractive than it otherwise would be. There are very, very large machinery used in this process, which further complicates the problem. Some of these trucks are so large they're not allowed on the state highways. They have their own separate road system to get to the mill, and that requires a large road, which in some cases is more visually damaging than the clear cutting. There are many different ways of getting these logs off the mountain. One is a helium-filled balloon. You put about $20,000 worth of helium in that thing, and it will lift the logs up over a ridge and carry them down the other side to a loading area at the bottom where they can be put on trucks. Then you can go to a helicopter, which is a very, very expensive proposition, but in those circumstances where the countryside is too steep or too ecologically unstable or geologically unstable to build roads, a helicopter will haul more wood off the mountain faster than you can blink, and it really pays for itself and offers you all sorts of constructive opportunities, as long as it doesn't have to haul it too far to get to some flat place where it can be put on a truck for the long haul to the mill. A helicopter is a landscape architect's dream because it can create almost any shape, size, opening that you can think of. The old-fashioned way, and still used for the most part, is a skyline, which is a very tall spar that stretches a cable about the size of your wrist down the mountain a half a mile or almost a mile in some cases. They run a carriage up and down this cable. The carriage is about the size of a pickup truck. And cables coming down from the carriage pick logs up, hoist them into the air, and they're hauled up to the top here, piled in a heap, put on a truck, taken to the mill. And then also, in some circumstances, the old-fashioned horse is coming back. Very, very careful work can be done with horse, and believe it or not, they're going to be the thing of the future. The landscape architects have come up with an even more interesting scheme that is ecologically sound and just flabbergasting from an environmental standpoint. Hasn't been accepted too well yet because the production is not all that high and it won't work in the winter. But we think maybe it's going to really come on one of these days. And will take its place alongside of these other systems that I've shown you. So, here we are creating various visual impacts which stretch all the way from this that had no design thinking in it whatsoever. It was just the cheapest, quickest way to do the job to get the cutout. It's not hurting anything except one's visual senses. And on down the line. Nowadays we're beginning to shape some of these things. These two are clear cuts. This is an old cut, and this is a natural opening. Eventually, when this greens up and a pattern is created, but we come in here for another entry about 50 years afterwards, this will begin to take on a rather pleasing appearance, I think, just as some of the aspen stands in here versus the spruce present a good visual appearance. So something like this would probably meet our modification visual quality objective and would improve over time. We can get all the way to this sort of thing where this was done by helicopter. And once that greens up, because it emulates the natural openings in the area, the average citizen would not even be aware of that. You and the forester might notice it because you know what you're looking for, but in about 5 years, the average citizen wouldn't know that anything had been done there. Frankly, some of these openings up here are clear cuts and some of them are natural, and I can't remember which. The average citizen is not aware of that sort of thing. So there we probably met the retention visual quality objective. Here's another major cut. They took millions of board feet off this mountain. And here is where we're mixing some clear cuts with some partial cuts, thinning, seed trees, whatnot, and just for the same purpose. Rather noticeable now because freshly cut you see the brown of the forest floor, but in a couple of years that'll green up and look very much like this stand over here. In many places, especially in the west, where we still, believe it or not, have some virgin timber, we have long, large mountainsides, a very uniform appearance. We're striving by design and by purposefully in a harvesting silvicultural pattern to begin to work towards this sort of thing and eventually towards this kind of a pattern where over the years this is freshly cut and now seedlings. In 50 years or maybe 30 years it'll look like this, 30 years later it'll look like this, and eventually it'll look like this. But by then we will probably have cut this down to this, and we'll get this pattern that will rotate. Every 30 to 50 years there'll probably be another entry in there that will keep the pattern changing. In the early days, we used landscape architectural pattern or talents quite a bit to take an aerial view like this. So the foresters would locate the stands of trees that they wanted to harvest or that needed attention, draw them on there, and say, now, what would that look like if we were to do that? This being what the countryside looks like from a vantage point where the public gathers to view it. And the LA, by normally doing cross sections and a lot of other fussy work that we now rattle off on a computer in an hour, would calculate what all of these clear cuts would look like, and even more importantly, what the road system that would be used here to get to it, where that would fit on the land and what it would look like, to give the manager an idea what the alternatives were and what his options were. This is the part of our visual resource management that we're focusing most on now, is the actual application to timber management operations. We have a slide tape and other training programs for each one of the items listed here. I'm just picking and choosing from it and showing you a very, very brief run tonight. We spend weeks training some of our people on this sort of thing, both foresters and landscape architects. What we're focusing on most heavily is what we call corridor viewshed planning. Those areas that are visited by the most people, especially the more heavily traveled roads and other traveled ways, where timber is being harvested in a large scale. And we try to set goals before we go into this. What species do we want to feature? How big should we let it get before it's harvested for the second time? What kind of bark characteristics? Ponderosa pine, for example, is black and rather nondescript until it gets about 100 years old, and then the bark turns a beautiful yellow-orange, and these yellow bellies, as we call them, become very scenically attractive, can be seen for a long distance. And so in most areas where ponderosa pine grows, we want at least a certain amount of it in yellow bellies, which means you let them get to a very advanced age. Other assorted considerations that we have to make, and we begin to plan over a long period of time. If we have an area here, and this is a very graphic representation, we have an area along a road that is all uniform, say old growth now, maybe more trees dying than reproducing. How do we get it from this, we don't want it to all die and fall over at the same time, over to a desired mix where we have some old growth, some seedlings, some pole-sized timber, and some mature. We start to look at this by stand. The foresters do that, and we determine, okay, at the first entry we'll come in and we'll cut these areas here. At year 50, this will become seedling size as it's cut. Another 50 years will come along, and that will have grown up to pole size, and we'll come in and cut some more areas, which will be seedling size. This will be large pole cut, probably, or pole size in the year 150, which is probably ready for commercial thinning by then. And in year 200, the same area is now in mature timber, and if we decide to leave some of it to old growth and die and fall over and make homes for woodpeckers and pileated woodpeckers and snowy owls and I don't know what all, this would be then the desired circumstance, and every 50 years this would change as we come back again. Just, of course, none of us will be around to see it, and some changes may be made along the way, but at least we are purposefully planning this kind of layout. And in actuality, along a real road, this is the way it might look if it's all uniform, and we begin to break this up into plots, different stands of trees, and this is the first one that would be harvested and so forth. Trying to determine the desired character. How much of which size, again, do we want where along the road? There are generally two loops on this. You can let the trees get to be mature. Most industry lands would be harvested at that point, and they would take the shorter loop. When the trees got this large, they would be harvested, they'd go back to this size, and they'd go around. The National Forest, we have additional considerations like rare and endangered species that need perhaps some of this old growth. Maybe we're looking for yellow bellies for their scenic characteristics or whatnot. We would be more likely, especially along these corridor view sheds that we talk about, to use the outside loop and go through all four stages here. In other places where there were a much lower sensitivity level, any fewer people looking at it, and where production was more important, we might also take the shorter loop. Along these corridor view sheds, we want to consider the biological units involved. Here's ponderosa pine, part of it, aspen on part of it. We also consider the visual and associated resources. Most of this here is foreground because you can't see very far into the stand. There are maybe a few places where you can see middle ground off in the distance. Of course, the meadow has its particular visual characteristics. Try to put all this together. Don't lose my voice yet. Into management response units, which is merely a description of how each of these areas would respond if you did this or that or some other alternative management practice. One of the biological considerations might be something like this situation out west where ponderosa pine grows in large grassy areas. Naturally, fire would come through there and consume all of this young growth. It would be resisted by the old trees because their bark is very thick. Smokey Bear came along and kept the fires out, and so these young firs started invading the site. The firs use the moisture that the large trees need, and when it got like this, the large tree started to die. Its branches are already falling to the ground, and finally by 77, it's dead and gone, and we are beginning now to wake up and take the firs out of there because they're competing with the pine that we really want on that site. There's all sorts of biological characteristics of different species and different species groups in all different parts of the country that have to be considered in this sort of thing in order to predict what will happen. We have to consider the wind. If we're not careful, we harvest timber in patterns that might create a Venturi effect, which blows all of the remaining timber down. And so where the wind is coming from and the shapes of these cuts not only is designed from a visual standpoint, but also from a wind resistance standpoint. Considering biological edges, natural edges that we can shape these cuts to fit. Much of this in here has been clear cut. Some of these openings are natural biological openings. Trying to fit it all together. These are the Grand Teton Mountains. A lot of people looking at this area. We're trying to be particularly careful and meet, if we can, in much of this area, that retention or partial retention visual quality objective that we talked about. We get back to these logging methods now. Here we're talking about the Skyline Logging, where we put up the spar and this carriage is carrying logs up the hill. landscape architects can ask for designs in this harvesting that cause the logging engineer to fall over in a dead faint. We like islands and peninsulas and things like that. And when you're talking about hauling 200-foot trees off the mountainside in very steep country, it is extremely difficult. You can't haul a log over this island, or the log usually will dangle down enough to knock the tops out of the trees in there. So they set up one of these Skyline posts here, for example, the spar, and they run a cable down here, and the carriage runs up and down this cable, pulling felled trees into the cable, raising them up in the air, and hauling them up to here, and piling them up in a pile, and another crane puts them on a truck, and off they go to the mill. And so they harvest all the timber they can get around this skyline, then they cut it loose here, and they drag it over here and stretch it out, fasten it down here, and they harvest all the timber they can get along this skyline. Then they stretch it down here, and they harvest all the timber along this one that they can reach. Then they run the cable down the skyline, and they establish another spar down here. And from this one, then they start logging in this direction, pulling all the logs back, pile them up here, and eventually they'll run those up this line to this place here. Now, if the landscape architect hadn't specified this island here, they would have logged the whole place from here and here, just by stretching their lines across. So in some cases, this becomes a problem in economics. Do we want to pay the extra shot that it's going to cost to set up this additional swing line here in order to leave that island there? And you also have to figure the future in, because sometime in 100 years maybe, or 50 years, we'll want to come back and take the island out, because this will have all grown up at that time. And the island, of course, will be very simple at that point. They can log that very quickly and very easily. So that will be cheaper in the future, but it's much more expensive now. Where do you want to put your investment? So we find landscape architects getting involved in all sorts of strange things that when they were going to Ball State or Michigan or wherever, they never gave anything like that a thought. How to begin to harvest a timber that is equally old age along a scenic road. In order to prove this, one of our landscape architects made this model. He had his kids dipping matchsticks in sponge rubber for I don't know how long. He says he got 4,000 trees on this thing. But it came out so realistic, we've had forest supervisors ask what national forest this picture was taken on. And that just tickles his fancy no end. Okay, if you want to harvest timber on this steep mountainside above a scenic road, how do you do it and still make it visually acceptable? Well, one way is to use your Skyline system and start with a clear cut up on the mountainside that can't be seen at all from down here. Then it starts to reproduce, and as the young seedlings and whatnot come up there, you add a clear cut here. Well, first here we took a clear cut on top, but we took a partial cut here. In this one we come back and we get all those trees that are standing out there by themselves, and we move down the mountain. These trees are getting much larger, and building a backdrop so that by the time we get to this, where you can begin to see through these trees, you aren't looking at a black wall 200 feet high, which is our real problem visually in some of that country. You're looking at this regrowth that is stair-stepped up from very small trees to large ones. You're giving the people that travel this road a glimpse of this sort of greenery up here, and making it a very pleasurable experience. And not only that, you're probably producing a great deal of wildlife habitat, because you're producing all sorts of edge around here, which is much more palatable to many more species than the old virgin timber. Just jumping around here, foreground applications along one of these visual corridors. Pushing the wrong button there. It's quite possible to carefully clear out some of this timber for sale and clear out and produce a vista of a rock feature or something like that was there all the time, but nobody could see it for the trees. Eventually the new growth will grow up and close it in again, but perhaps by that time we will be clearing a chunk over here and making it visible again. So as we build this pattern along a visual corridor, we can keep providing vistas of one kind or another. Along another road, for example, notice these two trees. After a treatment here, same two trees. It's quite possible to do all sorts of cleanup along roads like this, sometimes with horses or very simple methods of logging. that are both biologically and visually acceptable and beneficial. Here, this was done before the age of the computer, and frankly, the landscape architect goofed a little bit. We cut this one a little bit too long, and so the fire break along the top of the clear cut shows up very much. This one was a little better, this one goofed a little bit, but if we had really been on the money, they would all have looked a little better than this one, and we'd had very little visual impact from the big recreation site that's on this side of the lake. With our desktop computer that we play with today, we probably would have gotten a more accurate picture of what we were dealing with there, and might have pulled it off better. In background, for example, many years ago, before we paid much attention, somebody made a clear cut up here that was a perfect square notch, looked like the devil, and was extremely noticeable just because of its geometric shape. Here they have put out another cut and blended this side of it in. Eventually they'll come back and do the same over here. And by leaving some islands and whatnot blended into where the average person wouldn't even realize that anything had been done up there. The same program applied to timber management where it was developed actually. We can take an aerial view, a plan view of what a harvest activity will look like. The computer will show us what it will look like in an oblique view from any point that we select, and we'll draw predetermined sized trees all the way around it so you can see how much of it is covered up. And it will draw for you a simulation of what it will look like 30 or 40 or 100 or 150 years from now, depending on what kind of an operation you want to put on in there. In this case, we were talking about a 12% cut, and we wanted to see what it would look like in the 40th year. So the computer shows us where the openings will be, and will do us a simulation of what it would look like 4 decades from now. If we did that percent cut, if we did something like 17, this would be the layout, and that's about what it would look like 4 decades from now. So we can work with the land manager, especially when we're trying to get public input into these various forest plans, and we now have a tool where we can go to the public and we can say, if we do this, this is what it'll look like. If we do that, that's what it'll look like. This will have such and such an economic impact on the mill in town that employs all of your people. It will have this kind of an impact on the transportation corridors, on recreation, et cetera, et cetera. So we're beginning to get some excellent visual tools here that are remarkably accurate. And we don't have to take a back seat to anybody. Before, any time we opened our mouths, they would always say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and forget it. Everybody differs, and you can't pin anything down. But we're really getting to the point now where we can do some fairly accurate simulation, this being a close-up of the last one, and can begin to predict rather accurately what the visual impacts of many of these practices will be. In the field of roads, again, here's kind of timber operations alongside a road where you can begin to open up vistas or see into the timber, or you can feature areas and species. If you're in an area that's predominantly pine and you want to show up some of the aspen, fine, you can work on that by removing the pine and eventually get into some of your fall color that's so attractive in many places. Or you can remove some inhibiting species that open up vistas, make your travel more enjoyable. In the field of range management, there's a great deal in the West that's done to improve range or put it back in the stage that they think it was in when the white man arrived. This is chaining out in Nevada, Utah, and that country, New Mexico, Arizona, where they drag a chain between two tractors and knock down all of this pinyon juniper shrub or scrub. This is a herd of wild horses out here. Incidentally, that's about the closest I could ever get to them. You know, it's a very large-scale operation in some places. In the old days, it used to be done in kind of a gridiron pattern, and they would pile up the refuge out there, and it really looked like a bell. Now we tend to follow soil types and adapt some of these shapes to the local terrain. And the end result, hopefully, is something like this, where you can really get the grass reestablished. You've probably all heard that term that the Westerners use when the cowboys... The only place you can stop one of those fires is on ridge tops, and so it's been customary in the past to make these fire breaks up and down Hillendale. where they can get equipment and where the fire has less material to burn. And they discovered that if they trimmed the lower branches off the manzanita, it worked almost as well as removing it entirely, within reason. And so we begin to get the option of creating this kind of an African savanna up there, rather than these horrendous-looking stripes that go over ridge to ridge to ridge. This one, they got some of their sides a little too angular and a little too abrupt, but I think you can see some of the potential here. This fire break is just as effective, if not more so, than what they used to do. The whole field of utilities management, here we have this proposition and what to do with it. There's going to be some timber harvesting operations in the area anyway, and so we have the landscape architects work up an artistic rendition of what it would look like if we did it in this fashion, or if we did it something like that, how to make this thing kind of blend into the countryside. And in a plan view, I look something like that. We have an existing situation here back in the good old days when they cleared a swath, whether they needed one or not, and what to do with that. Some more artistic renditions of how to make this blend in its surroundings, and here where they've started to carry it out. Another similar one. And here again, some things that can be done with it. Some of these things have very significant wildlife benefits when they're creating more edge. Some of it involves leaving the trees in the right-of-way. Finally, I've convinced power companies that that can be done. They just insist that you don't have any trees where it'll fall on the lines. But instead of removing the trees, many species will react very favorably if you just top them. And so we've cut the tops out. So far, we've not found a landscape architect to volunteer for the job, but it does get done. Kind of a hairy proposition. But to take the tops out of some of these trees allows you to leave them in the right-of-way, and you can get effects like this, where the power line from a distance is hardly visible at all, especially if you can get the tower locations on natural open bald spots. These contraptions are very useful and are being used all the time out west for installation purposes. It eliminates much of the road building that used to be done for this sort of thing, and quite often the building of the road in that country was more visually damaging than that swath that they cut for the power line. One problem being that it takes a tremendous marshalling yard to assemble all of these partial pieces of towers and whatnot that is fairly close to the operation, so that the chopper doesn't have to burn up $1 zillion worth of fuel in order to get to where it's going, and pick them up and away they go. Most ski lifts, or a great many ski lifts, are now being installed the same way by helicopter. They carry concrete up there for the footings, and then they carry the towers piece by piece. And occasionally, although it's very costly, they will plant trees in some places where it's necessary. The problem being in the West, you usually have to water these for at least the first summer, and that gets to be a real pain. But there's no other way to bring them through. And then we have the proposition of good old horse. For clearing some of the rights-of-way in a sensitive way, this being a place in Colorado where they had to take a good deal of timber out in order to get a power line in, and there was no place to sell it, there was no mill nearby, so they piled it up down the road. On Thursday night, they put an ad in the local newspaper, free firewood, and by Sunday afternoon, they had no more problem. And this was before the real advent of the stove, so as long as they can get it to a place where it can be reached by the public, I don't think we have any problem in the future. Some of their facilities, we have worked with architects to try and design something a little better and a little different than what we had before. This is a switching station for a microwave system. It was set up at a major ski area when they expected the Winter Olympics, and they expected a great deal of microwave traffic for TV and whatnot. It was going to be a kind of a steel Butler building sort of thing. We prevailed upon them to get more in tune with the local area, and very carefully sited it in the aspen on the other side of the interstate and the main ski area here. And now the local gas station gets all sorts of inquiries as to whether or not it's possible to eat dinner at the top of the tower up there, and some want to know if services will be held there on Sunday. But it's really just a building to hold horn antennas and a lot of switching equipment. Many of these things allowing us, of course, to to meet these various visual quality objectives that we talk about. This is a project to put a pipeline over the mountain in Colorado, way above timberline in a very, very fragile alpine tundra. The pipeline had the best location for it was to go right down here into the timber where we could hide it by other means. But this tundra was so fragile that there are wagon tracks visible there that were put there when the pioneers came through that country, and they're still there. Prevailing upon the Texas pipeline layers to do something unusual here was a little difficult, but it worked. The pipeline was laid along this old railroad trestle in one place in order to hide it. We got them to use what they called a garden tractor to dig the trench and carefully lay the sod on plastic and cover it with burlap and water it. And then something new and different, they ran this cable down the trench and they welded all the pipe together down there in the trees. And looking up the trench the other way, they put a D9 cat at the top, tied the cable around the pipe, and pulled the pipe up the trench. So they never had to get out on the tundra with any kind of tracked equipment to lay the pipe as they normally do. And when they got through, they very covered it back over again, very carefully covered it. And today it's very difficult to find where the pipeline is. And that meets our retention visual quality objective any day. So that's our visual quality program, so to speak. As you know, we can deal with all kinds of forests, from the cypress that get their feet wet, the aspen of the west, and even sequoia. And we get to the good old maple to the east. It's not all roses, though. There are some difficulties involved in this work. One of our fellows came across this Alaska brown bear that had an unusual patch on its rump and wanted to get a picture of it. And so he threw a rock at the bear in order to get it to look up and pay attention. And the bear did that. He took this picture, and just as fast as he could, he cocked the camera and shot the second picture. It was rather startling. The gun bearer was alongside and fired into the ground, and that didn't bother the bear at all. So the gun bearer ran up the slope, and the cameraman ran down the ridge. And the bear skidded to a halt right where they were standing and decided he didn't like the smell of those two. I guess landscape architects are unpredictable or something. Anyway, the bear decided he didn't want to eat them that day, and he let them go. They were very thankful for that, but somewhat shaken at the experience. All kinds of scenery from the Pacific Northwest. We even have desert, believe it or not. Glaciers of Alaska. Mountain country in Colorado. National forests even contain a chunk of beach in California. And the sun sinks slowly into the west, the end of all good slideshows. Whoops. I know you're all anxiously awaiting word from the Reagan administration, which you won't get tonight. Mainly because we don't know quite what they're up to yet. But several things are coming through. I think it's safe to say that there will be an increase in commodity production on the national forests. We're going to be under pressure to produce and sell more timber, bring in more receipts, probably from recreation facilities and that sorts of thing, primarily under the philosophy that those who use should pay. Why should someone who's confined to the inner city, who never gets out to the national forest, pay for campgrounds when those who use the darn things probably are paying considerably less than what the experience is worth? Kind of a new philosophy, one that I think we're going to see more of. I think we'll see less regulation. Our environmental studies, praise be to Allah, may get shorter and less complex. There may be less emphasis on wilderness. As I say, there'll probably be more emphasis on higher fees. The effects of all this on landscape architecture, maybe architecture. I would suspect that private offices will probably prosper. Anything that begins to promote and make easier development or construction or expansion or whatnot in the country will probably furnish more and more interesting work for private offices. and I think they should thrive and thereby provide more employment for people like yourself. In government, I think perhaps just the opposite will be true. I think Mr. Reagan means business when he says that government is too big and we're going to cut back in size. I think we'll be doing that. I suspect the internships, summer employment, and that sort of thing will become more scarce. It may dry up entirely this summer. The numbers of professionals like ourselves being hired and probably in the next few years will decrease, I think, although it has not been cut off entirely. There was a ceiling that has now been lifted, and now the agencies are allowed to run their own boat as they see fit, but we've been given some very, very strict ceilings. In some places we're going to have to lay off some people if it remains as it has first comes down. This doesn't mean that if one of our land managers wants a landscape architect badly enough, he can go out and hire him, but he may have to do that at the expense of not hiring 3 other people or letting someone go. It remains to be seen. I think there will definitely be a cut in federal payments or grants or support of some kind to state and local bodies for some things like planning and perhaps recreation that normally does employ landscape architects. So this may make employment in that sector more difficult in the next few years. Whether the two will balance out or not remains to be seen. I'm often asked, I'll take one last shot at you. Since I have the podium, I'll make my 2-cent speech for the day. I'm often asked why designers aren't more effective, especially landscape architects. And I kind of like to demonstrate maybe here, if I can get a little help from the audience, from one small group. I'd like to have you, sir, stand up. Yeah. And we'll skip one, and then have you 5 stand up. This 5 in the row right here. Okay. And then if these 2 would stand up and just kind of get off to the side here a little bit. Now, these stalwart assistants aren't going to have to do anything but look pretty. If all of you were to come back here in 5 to 10 years and have a gathering of all your brethren, and all the other schools of landscape architecture did the same, probably architecture too, although my statistics don't cover that profession, I think you would probably find, if these people were to represent the entire group, that the following would be pretty close to true. These 2 gentlemen, and I'll use a couple of examples from my past. This august statesman on the far right here, he graduated from school, got his BLA, and 3 days later got married. And his father-in-law says, "Son, I have a very prosperous insurance agency over in Podunk City here, and I'd sure like to have you come into business with me." And so he did, and he's been selling insurance ever since. He never practiced landscape architecture a day in his life, been very prosperous, but as far as the profession is concerned, he never did anything for us. So you can sit down, sir. This next gentleman, he took ROTC in college. I don't know if that still exists or not. Anyway, after college, he went in the Air Force, and they taught him how to fly. And he took that for about 4 years, and then he got out and he went to work as a landscape architect. But that called for a great deal of outdoor work. And every time one of those things went over, well, he'd say, "Oh, there's a 707, and there's a DC-8. After about a year of that, American Airlines started hiring, and he is now a co-pilot on a 747 that flies back and forth to Karachi from New York City. So you can sit down, sir. He never practiced landscape architecture more than 1 year. These 5 people, they all went to work in the profession from 8 to 5. None of them, in all the time they've been out of school, has ever joined his professional society, has never contributed anything, time, money, or otherwise, to his alma mater, has never done anything for the profession as a whole, except go to work from 8 to 5. Each one of them is convinced that they've done great and wonderful things for the profession because of the various projects they worked on during the daylight hours and so forth, but not one of them has ever gone beyond that. Now, these four can sit down. They have contributed from 8 to 5 to the profession, but they've done nothing really to push it forward as a body. This gentleman, he's never bothered with his professional society or his alma mater or anything else for the profession, but at least he had the foresight to go and get on a local planning commission, or he does work for various committees and other local functions, and so his community is probably aware that he's a landscape architect, and they are there better informed, and perhaps he's generated some use of our profession. So he's done at least a little something for us, and now he can sit down feeling good about himself. This remaining stalwart soul of the whole group represents what's left that does participate. He at least pays his dues. He goes back to the alma mater. He does what he can for the students. He's in there pushing for the profession as a whole. Probably only 1/4 of him, say from maybe the shoulders up, has gone beyond that and actually expends time, has actually been active in committees, taken office, run the local chapter, really got into it and contributed all the way. Not only just paying dues, but the whole Mary Ann. And on his shoulders, from here up, is where a very, very great deal of the impact, the visibility of the profession lies out of this whole mob. From the shoulders up is about all anybody in this country is going to see of landscape architecture. And until we get a better degree of participation than that, people are going to still ask me, why aren't we more effective? Thank you, sir. Now, if anybody wants to ask some questions, I will try to struggle through some answers, if there are any, until it's time for whatever these root beer floats are. Yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about very much physical values that you're dealing with, you typically show these drawings and so forth to some kind of public group, the simulated drawing of visual patterns, type. For the most part, you show that to some kind of group, some kind of audience, get their reaction.
Sometimes, depending on what the topic is.
I guess.
Oh, she's wondering if we show these drawings. I'm assuming she's talking about the visual printout or the computer printout simulations. If we show those at public groups for input when we're seeking their input.
The expression a lot, the average person will never notice. I guess I'm kind of interested in who the average person is and what their values are and how that builds into the system that you have, or it's just an administration that thinks that they have the bottom line of what it should look like, and the average person sees it this way, and whether or not, like, for example, if you ever do any post-construction evaluation where you come back and say, how does this look to you?
That's primarily where management is looking at the landscape architect and make this kind of evaluation. And frankly, we're not all that sophisticated. We haven't been doing it long enough in many places to know exactly the feedback. But we have gotten some very, very strong feedback in some places. In fact, it's brought whole national forests to their knees from the management standpoint, and with some of these Donnybrooks we've had in the environmental area. And in many cases, we're at an extreme disadvantage there because the public will not level with us. They're ashamed to say that they don't like the looks of it. That's considered to be kind of a namby-pamby, something less than American manhood sort of answer. And so they say, my God, it must be eroding off the hill, or that's horrendous for wildlife or something. They'll dream up all sorts of so-called ecological consequences of this practice they're complaining about, when in reality, if you can ever pin them down, they just don't like the way it looks. Looks too phony. They think this is public land, it should look natural. whatever natural is to them, and that's tricky too.
But is that not what you're trying to manage? For the most part, is what they think is natural?
For the most part, you know.
Do you have some
Now you see in the South, in some places, for example, in the South they have these mountain balls. The top of the mountain has no trees on it. The people have been living with that so long they think it's natural. Actually, the first settlers cut it off, and then they grazed goats and cattle and whatnot up there, and they just decimated the top of the mountain, didn't let anything grow. But it's been there so long, people think it's natural, and they like those mountain balls. Rhododendron grows out there and so forth. And so you can get that kind of a landscape over history becoming, quote, natural, at least it's natural to those people. And some of these things are very attractive, just like the Amish farming country and so forth. So we're constantly working with our researchers. We've tried to get social scientists and psychologists involved in this. They've not been of much help. Trying to determine that is very sticky wicket. But you can sure gauge the amount of flack you get or don't get. That comes through very quick and very fast.
and that has changed?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Landscape architects and the National Park Service are not engaged in this sort of thing in this kind of a systematic way, primarily because they don't do much to the countryside. Their charge, legislatively, historically, is to preserve the natural effect and to make it available to the people who want to come and see it. There's one hell of a problem. How you do both at the same time on the same ground is their big problem. But they don't harvest timber. By and large, they do not have ski areas. They don't do the sorts of things that we do by law that have a visual impact. So they don't create the problem in most places. So they're not so concerned about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, up until about 65, they were far and away the largest employer, had been for many, many years. And landscape architects have gone a long way in the Park Service. In fact, with Connie Worth, they had a landscape architect as the director. So the National Park Service has been a home for landscape architects since there's been a National Park Service. Mm-hmm. Did you raise your hand? Swatting flies or something? Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, they used to be available through the government printing office till they stopped printing them. So the school should have some somewhere in its library. If it doesn't, I'll see that they get some. We're having a hard time keeping them printed. They're expensive. They're in full color. And unless they're selling them by the zillion, GPO doesn't like to stock anything anymore. Beg pardon? I doubt it. If you could, they'd be in Xeroxed in black and white or something. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. You're speaking of the one slide I had of the scenic road in Arkansas and Oklahoma. There was a small war over those guardrails in those days. In building a road of that kind, we had to do it in conjunction with what was then the Bureau of Roads. And they insisted on corrugated metal guardrails for safety's sake, come heck or high water. So we finally got them to use Core 10 or something that wasn't quite so noticeable, but we don't always have free say in that sort of thing. You quite often get two or more agencies involved in the construction of such a facility, and the strongest one tends to win on some parts of it and others on the other parts. Many of these roads end up being maintained by the county. And they sometimes do, but generally no. If it's an entirely Forest Service road, very seldom. Makes a bigger mess than it's worth. We've had some problem with railroads doing that. They come along and spray everything. They're afraid they're going to set fire to it, but they kill the vegetation and they set fire in the dead vegetation. Hot boxes and whatnot. Oh. Well, I thank you very much. It's been a very pleasant evening.